Hello and welcome. Take a moment to settle yourself, to rest your body, and to let the rhythm of your breath slow down. Tonight, I invite you on a gentle journey through time to explore the story of an ancient people whose voices once echoed across mountains and valleys, and whose memory still whispers through the stones they left behind. Think of this as a quiet walk through history. We will not rush. We will move slowly, step by step, like wandering along a shaded path. As you listen, you may let your thoughts drift sometimes, following the story closely, other times letting it fade into the background, carrying you toward rest. So, close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the soft glow of distant fires, the sound of wind brushing against ancient walls, and the timeless rhythm of life long ago. Together we begin. Now, let us gently turn the page of history. From one chapter to the next, imagine the story unfolding like layers of fabric, each one connected to the other, soft and seamless. With every step, we move deeper into the memory of a people who shaped their world and left echoes for us to find. Imagine yourself standing on the rolling plains of ancient Anatolia, where the earth rises gently toward mountain ridges and wide skies stretch endlessly above. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of wild thyme and distant pine, while streams carve their way through fertile valleys. This land, thousands of years ago, gave birth to a people who would one day be remembered as the Hittites, an empire once so mighty that they challenged the power of pharaohs and kings. And yet today their name feels like a whisper in the corridors of history. The story of the Hittites begins in the early centuries of the second millennium before Christ. At that time, Anatolia was home to scattered settlements of farmers and herders. They lived in modest houses made of mud brick, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the seasons, sowing grain in the spring, harvesting in the autumn, and tending flocks that grazed along the hillsides. Life was simple, but the land itself held the seeds of something greater. Its position at the crossroads of continents meant that cultures and travelers, merchants and migrants, would inevitably pass through. Into this landscape arrived a group of Indo-European peoples. They were not conquerors in the sense of sweeping destruction, but rather settlers who mingled with the local Hessian population, absorbing customs and beliefs, while adding their own language and traditions. Over generations, these communities grew into towns, then into city-states, and eventually into something more united. The foundations of the Hittite world. Biancan Deramu, walking through one of their early cities. The streets are narrow, paved with stones worn smooth by countless feet. Clay jars sit outside doorways, filled with water drawn from nearby wells. Smoke rises lazily from hearths where bread is baking, its aroma mixing with the earthy scent of damp clay walls. Children chase one another in the alleys, while artisans shape metal into tools and ornaments. In the distance, a temple rises, its walls adorned with carvings of deities, gods who governed the weather, the harvest, and the mysteries of life itself. Religion, for the Hittites, was the fabric that bound their world together. They believed in a vast pantheon, so many gods that later scribes described their faith as the 1,000 gods of Hatti. Each city had its own patron deity, yet all were connected through rituals and festivals. Their storm god, Tarhunt, was especially revered, for in a land where agriculture sustained life, the cycles of rain and sun were matters of survival. Imagine standing in a Hittite temple as priests chant softly, their voices rising and falling like the wind. the fragrance of burning incense drifting through the air, creating an atmosphere both sacred and calming. But it was not only faith that gave the Hittites strength. Their land, rich in resources, offered another gift: iron. At a time when most of the world relied on bronze, the Hittites learned to work iron with increasing skill. This was not the iron of later centuries, forged into steel weapons of empires, but it was enough to grant them an advantage, both practical and symbolic. An iron blade was rarer and stronger than bronze, and possession of such an object was a mark of status. In time, this knowledge would help the Hittites rise above their neighbors and carve out a kingdom of their own. The heart of their growing power lay in Hattusa, their capital city. Perched high on a plateau, surrounded by walls that stretched 4 kilometers, Hattusa was both a fortress and a center of culture. Its gates were decorated with carved lions and sphinxes, symbols of guardianship and authority. Walking through these gates, one would have felt the presence of something extraordinary, a civilization on the cusp of greatness. Within, scribes worked diligently with clay tablets, pressing signs into the surface with reed styluses. These tablets recorded treaties, prayers, trade agreements, and even myths preserving the heartbeat of the empire for millennia to come. It is here, in Hattusa, that we see the first outlines of what would one day be called an empire. Kings ruled not as absolute monarchs, but as leaders bound by tradition and counsel. Their authority was both political and spiritual, for they acted as high priests in the service of the gods. Imagine the king standing at dawn on a temple terrace, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun, offering grain and wine to the storm god, believing that his prayers would ensure rain for the fields and peace for his people. Trade also flowed through the Hittite lands, connecting them with Mesopotamia to the east and the Aegean to the west. Caravans brought textiles, precious stones, and exotic goods, while in return the Hittites exported metalwork and grain. Along these trade routes came not only goods, but also ideas, stories, technologies, and artistic styles that blended into the fabric of Hittite culture. Thus, the Hittites became both receivers and contributors in the great web of ancient civilization. In these early centuries, life for the common people remained humble yet rich in meaning. Farmers rose with the sun, their hands rough from the soil, but their hearts tied to the rhythm of nature. Artisans carved intricate seals and jewelry, their designs reflecting both local traditions and foreign influences. Families gathered in the evenings around firelight, sharing food and stories, the crackling flames casting gentle shadows on mud brick walls. There was hardship, yes, but also a sense of belonging, a continuity between the land, the gods, and the people themselves. As night fell over Hattusa, the stars unfolded in brilliant clarity. Far from the smoke of modern cities, the ancient sky must have been a canopy of light, every constellation vivid and alive. For the Hittites, these stars were not merely distant suns, but symbols, guides, and perhaps even divine beings watching over their world. One can almost imagine lying beneath that sky, the air cool, the sounds of crickets filling the silence, while the city below slowly drifted into slumber. Thus, the beginning of the Hittites was not marked by sudden conquest or dramatic upheaval, but by the steady weaving of cultures, traditions, and innovations. They were a people shaped by their land, blessed with resources, guided by faith, and strengthened by the bonds of community. Their rise would be gradual yet profound, setting the stage for an empire that would one day rival Egypt itself. When you think of their beginning, think not of grand monuments or battles, but of a simple truth. The Hittites, like all great civilizations, began as ordinary people living ordinary lives until time and circumstance lifted them into the realm of legend. And as you let this image rest in your mind, the quiet valleys of Anatolia, the glow of hearth fires, the chants rising in temple courtyards, allow yourself also to drift gently as if carried on the same ancient winds that once whispered across the hills of a forgotten world. When we left the Hittites, they were rising quietly from scattered settlements into a kingdom. By the middle of the second millennium before Christ, this kingdom began to shine more brightly, entering what historians call its classical age. This was the period when the Hittites grew into a true empire, organized, sophisticated, state, with influence stretching across much of the ancient world. Imagine once again walking through Hattusa, their capital. Now it is no longer a modest city of mud brick houses and narrow lanes, but a sprawling metropolis alive with the rhythm of empire. The stone walls tower high, tracing miles around the city like the embrace of a giant. Gates stand tall, carved with guardian lions and sphinxes, each one a symbol of strength and divine protection. Inside, the city hums with the voices of traders, scribes, priests, and soldiers. The Hittite kings of this era ruled with a sense of balance. They were not distant figures hidden behind palace walls, but leaders who saw themselves as stewards of both people and gods. A king was expected to listen to his council, honor treaties, and uphold the traditions that bound the kingdom together. This system gave their government a kind of stability unusual for the time. Politics, however, was not their only talent. The Hittites became masters of diplomacy. At a time when most kingdoms relied on the sword, the Hittites learned to wield the pen, or more precisely, the clay tablet. They were among the first to write down international treaties, carefully recording terms of peace and alliance. These agreements were stored in archives, pressed into clay with cuneiform script. One such treaty, between the Hittites and the Egyptians after the famous Battle of Kadesh, is remembered as one of the oldest surviving peace treaties in the world. But treaties were not only about avoiding conflict, they were also about building trust. Kings exchanged letters with one another, calling each other brother, and sending gifts of gold, silver, textiles, and even princesses in marriage. Imagine the excitement in Hattusa when a caravan arrived from a distant land, carrying not only goods, but also stories, songs, and new ideas. Through such exchanges, the Hittites wove themselves into the fabric of the wider ancient world. Their economy, too, grew strong. Anatolia's fertile valleys produced grain, while its forests supplied timber and its mountains yielded precious metals. Merchants carried these goods to neighboring lands, returning with exotic items like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, and fine linens from Egypt. Within Hattusa, markets buzzed with life. Picture a stall where copper tools glint in the sunlight, another where spices fill the air with fragrance, and another still where pottery, painted with intricate designs, waits for eager buyers. This period also brought cultural richness. The Hittites were not content to remain isolated. Instead, they absorbed and adapted. From the Mesopotamians, they borrowed the cuneiform system of writing. From their local Hessian predecessors, they inherited rituals and deities. From their neighbors, they adopted new myths and artistic styles. Yet they always gave these borrowed elements a Hittite flavor. Their religion continued to grow, welcoming gods from conquered lands into their already vast pantheon. To the Hittites, this inclusiveness was not weakness, but strength. The more gods, the more protection. In temples across the empire, festivals marked the cycle of the year. Imagine the great spring festival of Puruli, celebrated in honor of the storm god. Priests would chant ancient hymns, musicians would play flutes and lyres, and dancers would move gracefully in circles. The festival was not merely ritual, it was a renewal of life itself, a way of ensuring fertility for the fields, prosperity for the people, and harmony between humans and the divine. Beyond religion, art and architecture also flourished. Relief carvings on stone walls depicted gods, animals, and scenes of daily life. These images were not violent or chaotic, but orderly, showing a world structured and protected by divine forces. Their palaces, though not as monumental as Egypt's temples, were grand in their own right, with columned halls, storerooms filled with goods, and courtyards where officials gathered to discuss the matters of state. Perhaps most remarkable was their use of writing. Hittite scribes recorded myths, laws, instructions, and prayers on thousands of clay tablets. These archives, preserved by the accident of time and rediscovered by modern archaeologists, offer us a glimpse into their world. Through them, we read about their gods, their kings, their treaties, and even their stories. Imagine a scribe at his desk, bent over a clay tablet, carefully pressing each wedge-shaped symbol into wet clay by the glow of a small oil lamp. His work, though routine at the time, became the voice of a civilization carried across millennia. Yet life in the classical age was not only about kings and treaties. For ordinary people, daily existence continued with rhythms, both simple and meaningful. Farmers tended to their fields, their plows drawn by oxen across the dark earth. Shepherds guided flocks across the hills, listening to the soft bells tied to the animals' necks. Families gathered in the evenings around firelight, sharing meals of bread, cheese, lentils, and perhaps roasted lamb. In villages, children played with clay figurines, while elders recited stories of gods and heroes, tales that kept cultural memory alive. The Hittites also had an early sense of justice. Their legal codes, while strict, reveal a society concerned with fairness. Unlike some laws of neighboring cultures, Hittite codes often emphasized restitution rather than harsh punishment. If someone damaged property, they might repay with goods rather than suffer physical harm. This approach suggests a culture that valued balance and harmony, not only in religion, but also in human affairs. By the 13th century before Christ, the Hittite Empire stretched across much of Anatolia and into northern Syria. From the capital at Hattusa, their kings oversaw a network of vassal states, alliances, and trade routes. They had become one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. To think that a people who once began as small communities of farmers had risen to stand among the giants of their time is a reminder of how civilizations grow slowly, steadily, and often quietly until they suddenly shine with brilliance. As evening falls on this imagined walk through Hattusa in its classical age, picture the city settling into calm. Merchants close their stalls, priests complete their evening offerings, and families retreat into their homes. From the palace, a soft glow of torches lights the walls, while the scent of burning cedar drifts through the air. Above, the Anatolian sky is once again alive with stars, silent witnesses to the rise of a people who, for a time, stood at the very center of history. Thus, the classical age of the Hittites was marked not only by power and expansion, but also by diplomacy, cultural richness, and a sense of balance. They were a civilization that preferred treaties to endless war, inclusion to exclusion, and harmony to chaos. In this way, they left behind not only monuments of stone, but also lessons in how to build a world both strong and just. And as you let this chapter settle into your thoughts, you may find yourself drifting into that same sense of balance between wakefulness and rest, between memory and forgetting, between the world of today and the echo of a forgotten empire that once thrived under the endless Anatolian sky. By the time the Hittites reached the height of their classical age, they were not alone in the world. To their east rose the wealthy cities of Mesopotamia, with their scribes, astronomers, and ancient gods. To their south lay Egypt, a kingdom of golden temples and timeless monuments. To their west, across the seas and mountains, smaller but restless cultures began to stir there. Mycenaeans in Greece, the traders of the Aegean, and the peoples of the islands. The Hittites lived at the crossroads of these worlds. Their homeland of Anatolia was like a great bridge between continents. And because of this geography, foreign influences flowed naturally into their empire. Imagine yourself in Hattusa during this period. The city is busy with visitors, merchants from Babylon with long beards and heavy cloaks, Egyptian envoys carrying letters sealed with golden emblems, and traders from the Aegean bringing jars of oil and fine painted pottery. Each arrival brought more than goods. They brought words, ideas, customs, and beliefs. Slowly, these influences became woven into the life of the Hittites. One of the clearest signs of this exchange was language. The Hittite scribes wrote in cuneiform, a system borrowed from Mesopotamia. On soft clay tablets, they pressed wedge-shaped signs, some for sounds and others for entire words. Although the spoken Hittite tongue was Indo-European, their writing system was foreign, a borrowed technology that linked them to the wider literate world. It was through this script that treaties were written, myths recorded, and royal decrees preserved. Without Mesopotamian influence, much of the Hittite story might never have been recorded at all. Religion, too, absorbed foreign currents. We already know the Hittites spoke of 1,000 gods, and this number grew as their empire expanded. When they conquered or allied with another city, they often adopted its deities, rather than replacing them. In northern Syria, they encountered gods of storms and fertility. In Mesopotamia, deities of wisdom and the underworld. Each was welcomed into the Hittite pantheon. In this way, their religion became a vast mosaic, a reflection of the diversity of the ancient Near East. Picture a temple courtyard during one of these great festivals. Priests dressed in embroidered robes chant prayers to a dozen different gods, some local, some foreign. The air is heavy with incense. The sound of drums echoes against the stone walls, and worshippers move in slow procession, carrying offerings of bread, wine, and fragrant oil. For the Hittites, these rituals were not a burden. They were a way of embracing the strength of many traditions, ensuring no god was neglected and no power left unacknowledged. Foreign influence also shaped the Hittite economy. Through long-distance trade, goods traveled astonishing distances for the time. From Egypt came linen so fine it seemed like woven air. From the Levant came cedar wood, straight and tall, perfect for building. From Mesopotamia came rare stones and luxury items. In return, the Hittites offered their metals, copper, silver, and iron. Iron, though still rare, carried great symbolic value. To own an iron dagger was to hold a piece of the future. This trade brought not only wealth, but also knowledge. Agricultural practices improved as ideas spread from one land to another. New tools, new methods of storing grain, new ways of organizing labor, all of these moved quietly along the trade routes carried by ordinary people whose names are lost to time. Diplomacy, too, was shaped by foreign contact. The Hittite kings corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs and Babylonian monarchs. These letters, preserved in clay archives, often used affectionate language. Kings called one another brother, even if rivalry lingered beneath the words. They exchanged daughters in marriage, strengthening bonds through family ties. Picture a young Hittite princess journeying south, her caravan loaded with gifts, her attendants whispering in strange tongues, her new life waiting in the halls of a foreign palace. For her, the exchange of alliances was not abstract politics, but a personal transformation. Of course, foreign influence was not always peaceful. At times, it came with conflict. The most famous of these was the clash with Egypt at Kadesh. Though the battle itself was fierce, its outcome revealed something remarkable. Both sides chose negotiation over endless war. The treaty that followed was inscribed on tablets, sealed with divine witnesses, and celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy. This moment, when two ancient superpowers chose dialogue, still echoes as a lesson in human history. But perhaps the most subtle and lasting influence came through stories and myths. The Hittites borrowed freely from their neighbors' tales, retelling them in their own way. Myths of Mesopotamian gods, stories of floods and heroes traveled into Hittite texts. Yet these were never simple copies. The Hittites adapted them, blending foreign stories with their own traditions until new narratives emerged. Imagine a storyteller by a hearth in Hattusa, reciting tales of a storm god's battle against a dragon, a myth that carried echoes of Babylon, yet sounded fully Hittite in its rhythm and meaning. Foreign artisans also left their mark. Styles of pottery, jewelry, and sculpture reveal mixtures of influence. A drinking vessel might show Mesopotamian motifs, while a relief carving might echo Egyptian forms. The Hittites were not afraid to borrow. They understood that culture is enriched, not diminished, by exchange. Even in law, foreign ideas found a place. The Hittites' legal codes, though unique, reveal similarities to Babylonian codes. The concept of restitution, of making amends rather than only punishing, was shaped by centuries of interaction with their neighbors. These laws helped stabilize a diverse empire where people of many tongues and customs lived side by side. At night, in the capital, foreign influences could be seen and heard in the very streets. Imagine walking through Hattusa under the stars. The voices of traders rise in many accents. Music drifts from homes, some melodies local, others borrowed from faraway lands. Lamps glow softly, lighting courtyards where families share meals flavored with spices not native to Anatolia. Even the sky above reflects this interconnected world. The constellations, charted by Mesopotamian astronomers, guiding travelers and priests alike. Through all these influences, the Hittites remained themselves. They did not lose their identity by welcoming others. Rather, they created a culture stronger, richer, and more resilient. because it embraced the wisdom of many peoples. When we look back at this period, we see not an empire standing alone, but one deeply connected to the ancient world. Their greatness was not built on isolation, but on exchange of goods, of ideas, of stories, and of faith. And as you rest with this thought, let the image form in your mind, the capital of Hattusa, alive with languages, customs, and colors from distant lands. The city is like a tapestry, every thread from a different place, yet together forming a pattern both beautiful and strong. Just as the Hittites drew peace from the harmony of many gods, so too can you draw calm from the harmony of many influences, blending softly into one. By the 13th century before Christ, the Hittite Empire stood tall among the great powers of the ancient Near East. What had once been a scattered collection of settlements, then a rising kingdom, had now become a force to rival mighty Egypt and proud Babylonia. To understand this growth, imagine standing once again within the walls of Hattusa, the empire's heart. From its high plateau, the city looked out across valleys and hills, a commanding view that mirrored the reach of Hittite authority. Inside, courtyards bustled with scribes, merchants, soldiers, and priests, each playing a role in the machinery of empire. During this period, the Hittite kings refined their style of rule. They were no longer only chieftains or high priests. They had become emperors, guiding a realm that stretched over diverse lands and peoples. Yet they ruled with a balance that was rare in ancient times. Councils of nobles and officials still advised them, and laws provided stability across the empire. One of the most notable rulers of this age was King Suppiluliuma I. His reign in the late 14th century before Christ marked a turning point. Under his leadership, the Hittites expanded into Syria, challenging Egypt for dominance. Through these, the Hittites managed not just to conquer, but to govern, weaving many cultures into the fabric of their empire. The empire's economy blossomed during this age. Fertile valleys produced grain that filled storerooms, while herds of livestock provided meat, milk, and wool. Skilled artisans worked copper, silver, and iron, shaping tools and ornaments that were prized across the region. Caravans carried these goods south to the Levant, west to the Aegean, and east toward Mesopotamia. Picture a long caravan winding its way down a dusty road. Donkeys laden with sacks of grain, jars of oil, and baskets of dried fruit. Alongside, merchants walk slowly, their conversations blending into the sounds of bells tied to the animals' necks. At each stop, goods are exchanged: cedar wood for silver, lapis lazuli for textiles, spices for copper. These exchanges were more than commerce. They were the threads that connected civilizations, binding them in shared prosperity. Iron remained a precious commodity, not yet common, but increasingly significant. The Hittite skill in working this difficult metal gave them prestige. An iron dagger or ornament was not just an object, but a symbol, carrying with it the promise of future technology. Roads linked distant towns, allowing for faster movement of armies and merchants. Fortifications grew stronger, with walls stretching for miles around cities. Within Hattusa, palaces and temples expanded, decorated with reliefs that celebrated both gods and kings. Water management, too, became more advanced. Canals and cisterns ensured supplies for the capital, while farmers in the countryside developed methods to make the most of seasonal rains. In a land where drought could bring hardship, These innovations meant survival. Scribes continued to fill archives with clay tablets, recording everything from royal edicts to international treaties. Thousands of these tablets have survived, giving us detailed insights into how carefully the Hittites managed their empire. The age of growth was also an age of cultural richness. With so many lands under their influence, the Hittites became a truly cosmopolitan empire. Their pantheon of gods expanded, their festivals grew more elaborate, and their myths more layered. Imagine the great autumn festival in Hattusa. The air is cool, the fields freshly harvested, and the people gather in the temple courtyards. Musicians play lyres, flutes, and drums, their melodies rising into the evening air. Priests lead processions, carrying sacred statues of gods, while offerings of bread, wine, and honey are laid before altars. The festival is not only a religious duty, but also a moment of joy, where families reunite, neighbors celebrate, and the community feels the harmony between humanity and the divine. Foreign influences enriched this culture further. Egyptian gods, Mesopotamian myths, and local Anatolian traditions blended into one spiritual landscape. Far from weakening the Hittite identity, this blending gave it strength, allowing the empire to unite many different peoples under one shared vision of the sacred. As the Hittites grew, so too did their role in global affairs. They became one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age, recognized by Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria as equals. Their kings exchanged letters with pharaohs, addressed as brothers, and their queens sometimes played central roles in diplomacy. One famous letter tells of a Hittite queen corresponding with a foreign king after the death of her husband. She sought to arrange a royal marriage for her son, a move both practical and political. These glimpses remind us that even in ancient times, women could wield quiet but significant influence in state affairs. The empire's reach extended south into Syria, where they held important cities such as Carchemish. These outposts became cultural bridges, places where Anatolian, Mesopotamian, and Levantine traditions met and mingled. To feel the pulse of this age, imagine yourself as a visitor in Hattusa during its height. You walk through the Lion Gate, its massive carved beasts watching silently as you pass. The streets are alive, with traders displaying colorful textiles, potters shaping clay, and smiths hammering metal. The smell of baking bread drifts from homes, while in the palace courtyard, officials debate matters of law and treaties. As evening falls, you hear the call of priests summoning worshippers to the temple. The flicker of torches glows against stone walls carved with sacred images. The city, once a quiet settlement of mud-brick homes, now breathes with the life of an empire. This age of growth seems strong and enduring, yet history reminds us that every peak is followed by challenge. The Hittites, though powerful, would face crises in the centuries ahead, pressures from within and without that would test their resilience. But in this moment, during their age of growth, they stood proud. They were farmers and warriors, merchants and scribes, priests and kings, all woven together into a society that had reached remarkable heights. As you rest with this image, let the thought settle like gentle evening mist. Civilizations, like people, grow in cycles. They begin humbly, they flourish, and eventually they change. The Hittites remind us that growth is not sudden, but steady, built day by day, until one day a people who began as villagers become remembered as an empire. And just as the stars rose over Hattusa each night, steady and eternal, so too does their story continue to shine distant and quietly luminous. Every empire has its moment of challenge. For the Hittites, that moment came not with a single disaster, but with a series of trials that tested the very foundations of their strength. The great walls of Hattusa still stood, the lion carvings still watched over the gates, and the palaces still rang with the voices of kings. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to appear, subtle at first, then widening with time. This was the age of crisis, a chapter when growth slowed, when unity frayed, and when the weight of enemies pressed harder than before. For many years, the empire's vast size had been a source of pride. From the Aegean coast to the plains of Syria, from the Black Sea mountains to the borders of Mesopotamia, the Hittites ruled over many peoples. But holding such a vast land together required balance, patience, and endless effort. Vassal kings, once loyal, began to waver. Some withheld tribute, others tested the limits of independence. Letters preserved on clay tablets show the frustration of Hittite rulers as they tried to keep their allies obedient. A single rebellious city might not have been a great threat, but when several grew restless at once, the fabric of empire began to stretch thin. At the same time, internal rivalries troubled the royal court. Succession was rarely smooth in the Hittite world. Brothers, sons, and even distant relatives might claim the throne, leading to disputes that drained the empire's energy. These struggles, whispered in palaces and debated in councils, weakened the unity that had once driven the kingdom forward. While the Hittites faced challenges within, dangers gathered beyond their borders. To the south, Egypt remained a powerful rival. To the east, Assyria grew ambitious, rising from a regional power into a force determined to expand. To the west, the mysterious sea peoples, migrating groups whose names remain uncertain, began to stir, their ships appearing along coastlines with both trade and plunder in mind. Armies marched more frequently now. Soldiers, once sent abroad to expand the empire, were increasingly called to defend it. Chariots rattled along dusty roads, and fortresses on the frontiers were strengthened. The empire was not yet collapsing, but the sense of strain grew heavier with each passing season. Imagine the scene: a weary soldier standing guard at a southern fortress, looking out across the plains of Syria. The sun beats down, his armor grows hot, and he wonders if the next horizon hides merchants or invaders. Such uncertainty became a constant rhythm in the empire's later years. Human rivals were not the only threat. Nature itself seemed to turn against the Hittites. Droughts struck Anatolia, reducing harvests and leaving storerooms less full than before. Famine became a shadow in the countryside, and when crops failed, unrest often followed. Clay tablets from this time record royal prayers to the gods, pleading for rain, for fertility, for relief. One tablet preserves the words of a queen who begged the storm god of Hatti to show mercy upon the land. Her prayer, both political and deeply personal, reminds us how even powerful rulers felt vulnerable when the skies withheld their blessings. A single dry season could be endured, but repeated years of poor harvests weakened the empire's resilience. Hungry people are restless people, and in such times, loyalty could not always be guaranteed. The throne itself was not free from turmoil. After the strong rule of kings such as Suppiluliuma and Mursili, later rulers struggled to maintain stability. Assassinations, betrayals, and contested claims scarred the royal court. In an empire where legitimacy came not only from blood, but also from the favor of the gods. Any disruption at the top threatened the entire system of order. Imagine the atmosphere within the palace walls. Torches flickering, guards standing tense at the doors, scribes whispering in corners as rumors spread of plots and rival claims. Though we cannot know every detail, the records left behind show that the later Hittite kings often reigned in an atmosphere of suspicion and unease. Beyond the Hittite heartland, the entire ancient world of the Late Bronze Age began to tremble. Great kingdoms across the region faced similar troubles. Egypt, too, endured invasions. Babylonia lost power. Mycenaean Greece suffered disruptions. It was as though the old order of civilization itself entered a storm. For the Hittites, this meant they could no longer rely on the balance of power that had kept the great empires in check. Allies grew weaker, rivals grew stronger, and the networks of trade that had once fueled prosperity were increasingly interrupted. When caravans no longer arrived on schedule, when merchants feared raiders, and when letters of reassurance from foreign kings stopped arriving, the web that tied empires together began to unravel. The Hittites were caught in the heart of this storm. Yet, even in this age of crisis, the Hittites were not without strength. One of the most famous events in their history took place during these years. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around the early 13th century before Christ between the Hittites and the Egyptians under Pharaoh Ramesses II. The battle was fierce, involving thousands of chariots on both sides, and though both sides claimed victory, the result was more balanced than either admitted. Out of this struggle eventually came one of the world's first known peace treaties, a remarkable document carved into stone, declaring lasting friendship between two mighty powers. This treaty, a blend of pragmatism and diplomacy, showed that even in times of crisis, the Hittites remained capable of wisdom and resilience. They were not a people who surrendered easily, but rather ones who sought solutions, even when pressed on all sides. Still, the crises accumulated. Grain stores never seemed full enough. Armies seemed constantly stretched thin. Palace intrigues grew more frequent. And along the frontiers, enemies pressed harder. From the outside, the empire still looked grand, its gates carved with lions, its temples busy with festivals, its kings writing letters to foreign rulers. But from within, the quiet erosion had begun. It is in such moments that history often shifts. Empires rarely fall in a single night. Rather, they fade slowly, piece by piece, until the day comes when decline can no longer be denied. As you rest with this story, imagine the empire in this twilight of its strength. The city of Hattusa still shines with torchlight at dusk. Children still play in its courtyards. Merchants still bargain in its markets. Priests still offer prayers to the storm god, asking for blessing and protection. Yet behind the daily rhythms lies a sense of unease, like a faint tremor beneath the ground. The people do not yet know it, but their world is entering its most fragile age. The Hittite Empire, once so full of growth, had stepped into crisis. And as night fell over Hattusa, the stars above looked down upon a kingdom struggling to hold its place among the giants of history. History often moves in patterns of challenge and renewal. For the Hittites, even as crisis pressed upon them, there was still an effort to modernize, to change, to adapt, and to find new ways of sustaining their empire. This period was not one of simple decline. Rather, It was an age of ingenuity, diplomacy, and resilience, as the Hittites worked to hold their place in a changing world. The great walls of Hattusa still stood, the temples still rang with chants, and the libraries of clay tablets continued to grow. Even in troubled times, the Hittites were builders, thinkers, and negotiators. Their legacy of adaptation is part of why their story remains remembered today. One of the Hittites' lasting contributions was their early mastery of iron. While most of the world still relied on bronze, the Hittites began experimenting with iron tools and weapons. The process was complex and imperfect, and iron was rare and precious. Yet the knowledge itself set them apart, offering a glimpse into the future that would eventually define a new age of civilization. Imagine a Hittite blacksmith at his forge. The air is warm, glowing with the red heat of the fire. Sparks rise into the night as he hammers the metal, shaping it carefully, testing its strength. Around him, apprentices watch with reverence, knowing they are witnessing a craft that carries the promise of power. Beyond weapons, the Hittites improved agricultural tools, helping farmers work the soil with greater efficiency. Even in years of poor harvests, these small advancements offered hope. The rhythm of iron on the anvil was not only the sound of survival, it was the echo of progress. The Hittites were remarkable record keepers. Their scribes filled thousands of clay tablets with everything from royal decrees to myths, prayers, treaties, and trade agreements. During this age of modernization, their archives expanded even further. In Hattusa, vast storerooms were lined with shelves of tablets. Each one carried marks pressed with a stylus, preserving the voices of kings, merchants, priests, and diplomats. These writings are why we know so much about the Hittites today. They were careful not only to rule, but also to remember. Picture a quiet chamber lit by oil lamps. A scribe bends over a fresh tablet, carefully pressing symbols into the soft clay. Outside, the city hums with daily life, but here, in this chamber, words are captured and stored for eternity. This devotion to writing gave the Hittites a kind of immortality, their voices echoing across millennia to reach us now. If the sword was one tool of empire, the penal, in their case, the stylus was another. The Hittites became masters of diplomacy. They negotiated alliances, forged peace treaties, and corresponded with the great rulers of their age. The pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Babylonia, the lords of Assyria. The most famous example remains the treaty with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh. This document, inscribed both in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, declared peace and friendship between two rival powers. It is considered one of the first known written peace treaties in history. Imagine envoys traveling across deserts and mountains, carrying letters sealed with royal insignias. They arrive at distant courts, bringing words of peace, promises of loyalty, or carefully balanced requests. In these moments, the Hittites showed that strength was not only about armies, but also about relationships. Modernization for the Hittites was not only material or political, it was also spiritual. Their pantheon grew as they absorbed gods from the cultures around them. The Hittites were often called the people of 1,000 gods, and during this period, their religious life became even richer. Temples expanded, rituals grew more elaborate, and prayers were composed with a poetic beauty that still survives on clay tablets. In times of uncertainty, faith was both a comfort and a unifying force. The festivals that marked the seasons brought communities together, filling the city squares with music offerings and the aroma of food prepared for celebration. Close your eyes and picture the scene, the sound of flutes and drums, the glow of torches at dusk, priests lifting their hands toward the sky, and children weaving through the crowds with garlands of flowers. In such moments, the empire felt whole again, its people bound by rhythms older than any crisis. Trade routes, though often threatened by unrest, continued to be lifelines for the Hittites. Caravans carried tin, copper, textiles, and fine pottery. Merchants adapted to dangers by forming larger caravans, hiring guards, and creating agreements with neighboring powers for safe passage. Markets in Hattusa buzzed with activity. Farmers sold grain and olives, shepherds brought wool, and foreign merchants displayed exotic goods. The marketplace was a living symbol of resilience, proof that even in uncertain times, life and commerce pressed forward. Such adaptability helped the Hittites maintain their influence longer than might have been expected. Though the storm clouds gathered, they still found ways to navigate the shifting winds of history. Another quiet form of modernization was in learning itself. The Hittites trained scribes, priests, and officials with care, ensuring that each generation could carry forward the knowledge of the last. They preserved myths, stories, and laws with a devotion that speaks to their sense of legacy. One tablet records a myth about the storm god battling a great serpent of chaos. Beyond its religious meaning, the myth may have offered a metaphor for the empire itself, an endless struggle to maintain order in a world of uncertainty. Such stories carried wisdom, not only for their own time, but for all who came after. Imagine sitting in a small chamber as a teacher reads aloud from a clay tablet, while young students listen, their minds absorbing both language and heritage. In these moments, the Hittites were planting seeds of memory, ensuring that their civilization would never be fully forgotten. The age of modernization was not without hardship. Crisis remained close at hand, and decline had already begun its slow path. Yet this was also an era of hope, invention, and adaptation. The Hittites did not simply fade quietly. They sought to renew themselves, to reshape their tools, their diplomacy, and their culture to meet the challenges of a shifting world. In many ways, their efforts worked. The empire endured longer than it might have, held together by ingenuity as much as by force. It is a reminder that even in fragile times, civilizations can find ways to shine. As you listen, imagine once more the city of Hattusa in this age. Blacksmiths hammering iron late into the night, scribes pressing careful words into clay, diplomats setting out on long journeys, priests chanting beneath the stars, merchants arranging colorful goods in the marketplace. This was a society not only surviving but striving, reaching for new ways to endure. The Hittites knew their world was uncertain, yet they continued to build, to dream, and to modernize. And so, as the night deepens and the stars turn slowly overhead, you may rest with the knowledge that even in times of difficulty, people of the past sought renewal. Their story is not only one of loss, but also of persistence, creativity, and hope. When we look back across the long river of time, we often see the great civilizations as islands rising above the waters. Egypt with its pyramids, Mesopotamia with its ziggurats, Greece and Rome with their temples and forums. Yet between these familiar names lies another island, quieter but no less important, the Hittite Empire. Though it has sometimes been forgotten, the Hittite role in world history is clear. They were bridge builders between cultures, innovators in technology, masters of diplomacy, and keepers of stories that still whisper to us from clay tablets. Their contribution is a reminder that even empires that vanish can leave footprints deep enough to shape the path of humanity. One of the Hittites' most enduring legacies is found not on the battlefield, but in the council chamber. The treaty they signed with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh remains one of the earliest recorded peace agreements in history. Carved in stone and preserved in cuneiform, the treaty declared friendship between two powers that had once been bitter enemies. It promised mutual defense, trade, and recognition of each other's sovereignty. In many ways, it was a forerunner of the international diplomacy we see today. Picture the scene: Egyptian envoys arriving in Hattusa, carrying gifts of gold and linen, greeted by Hittite officials in long robes. Words of rivalry set aside, replaced by cautious trust. In the quiet of the royal palace, two cultures shook hands across the divide of history. That gesture, though made thousands of years ago, speaks to the timeless human desire for peace. Another way the Hittites influenced the wider world was through their early mastery of iron. While bronze had defined the tools and weapons of earlier ages, iron was stronger, sharper, and more enduring. The Hittites did not keep this knowledge to themselves forever. Whether through trade, migration, or conquest, the knowledge of ironworking spread outward, eventually shaping the rise of new empires and new ways of life. Imagine the ripple effect: a farmer in a distant land plowing more efficiently with an iron blade, or a soldier wielding a sword that could cut more cleanly than bronze ever could. These quiet changes began with experiments in Hittite forges, where sparks leaped and history shifted. The Hittites also carried forward myths and stories that connected them to the broader ancient world. Their archives preserve tales of gods battling chaos, of divine councils, and of heroes striving against fate. Many of these stories echo across cultures, linking Anatolia to Mesopotamia, to Greece, and beyond. For example, their myths of a storm god fighting a great serpent resemble later Greek tales of Zeus battling Typhon, or Norse stories of Thor facing Jormungandr. These similarities remind us that human imagination flows across borders, carried by trade, migration, and memory. By preserving and adapting these stories, the Hittites helped weave the larger fabric of myth that still colors our understanding of the ancient world. The Hittite Empire stood at a crossroads of geography. To the west lay the Aegean, to the south the Levant, to the east Mesopotamia, and to the north the Black Sea. In this position, the Hittites became both recipients and transmitters of ideas, goods, and cultures. Through their markets passed tin from the east, wool from the highlands, grain from the plains, and wine from the valleys. Foreign merchants arrived with exotic wares, carrying not only goods, but also languages, customs, and beliefs. The Hittite heartland became a melting pot, a place where the world converged. Even today, archaeologists uncover artifacts in Hattusa that bear witness to this network: Egyptian jewelry, Mesopotamian seals, Mycenaean pottery. Each item tells the story of an empire that was never isolated, but deeply woven into the currents of its age. Another Hittite contribution to world history lies in their legal codes. Like their Mesopotamian neighbors, the Hittites wrote down laws to guide daily life. These laws addressed issues from property disputes to personal injury, from trade agreements to religious practices. What stands out is the humanity within their code, compared to some harsher systems of the ancient world. Hittite laws often showed a degree of fairness, emphasizing restitution over punishment. They reveal a society concerned not only with power, but also with balance, with keeping the rhythms of life steady and predictable. In this, the Hittites remind us that civilization is not built only on stone walls or armies, but on rules that allow people to live together in relative harmony. Though the Hittite Empire eventually faded, its influence lived on. The smaller Neo-Hittite states that survived in southern Anatolia and northern Syria carried forward elements of their culture, blending them with Aramean, Assyrian, and later Greek traditions. In this way, the Hittites acted as a bridge passing knowledge, art, and political ideas into the hands of those who came after. Their cities may have crumbled, but their cultural DNA continued to ripple outward, shaping the civilizations of the Iron Age. For many centuries after their fall, the Hittites were forgotten. Ancient writers mentioned them only briefly, and their ruins lay buried beneath hills and forests. It was not until the 19th century, when archaeologists uncovered the remains of Hattusa and deciphered their cuneiform tablets, that the Hittites returned to history. This rediscovery itself is part of their role in world history. They remind us that the past is never fully gone, that voices thought silenced can still be heard if we take the time to listen. As you rest with this story, imagine the Hittites not as shadows lost to time, but as neighbors in the great village of humanity. Their kings wrote letters to pharaohs. Their blacksmiths hammered the first iron. Their priests lifted prayers beneath the stars. Their scribes filled libraries with words that now travel across thousands of years to reach your imagination tonight. Their role in world history is not measured only in battles fought or lands ruled, but in connections made in the quiet threads of diplomacy, technology, law, and myth that continue to bind us together. So, as the night deepens and sleep draws near, remember that the Hittites, though gone, are still part of the story of us all. As we arrive at the final chapter of the Hittite story, imagine yourself once again in the quiet hills of central Anatolia. The air is calm, carrying only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant cry of birds. Time has passed, and the once mighty Hittite Empire is no more. Yet its traces linger etched into stone, whispered in languages, and remembered in the traditions of later peoples. Tonight, let us gently explore the legacy they left behind, and the way their story continued even after their cities grew silent. Picture yourself walking through the ruins of Hattusa, the capital city. The stone gates, carved with images of lions and sphinxes, still stand in partial silence. Their surfaces are weathered, but their presence endures. The walls that once encircled the city stretch across the hills like ribbons of memory. They no longer guard soldiers or rulers, but they protect something else, stories waiting to be heard. The fall of the Hittites around the early 12th century, before the Common Era, did not erase them completely. Their cities may have been abandoned, and their kings no longer ruled, yet the Hittites left behind tablets, monuments, and ideas that continued to shape civilizations long after their political power vanished. One of the most enduring gifts of the Hittites was their language. The Hittites wrote in cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped symbols into clay tablets. Within these tablets were myths, laws, prayers, and treaties. Among the most famous is the peace treaty they signed with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh. This treaty, carved into stone, is often regarded as one of the world's first recorded international agreements. When modern archaeologists uncovered these tablets, The Hittite language was unknown. Slowly, patient scholars deciphered the words, and to their surprise, they discovered that Hittite was not an isolated tongue. It was part of the Indo-European family, the same wide linguistic family that includes Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and many modern languages. In this way, the voice of the Hittites is still faintly present in the words we speak today. The Hittites were known for their detailed laws. Unlike some legal codes of the ancient world that emphasized harsh punishments, Hittite laws often showed a measured sense of practicality. Compensation was preferred over extreme retribution, and many laws reflected a society balancing fairness with order. Their diplomatic practices also left a strong legacy. The treaty with Egypt, for example, outlined mutual respect, defined borders, and even arranged for the exchange of royal family members through marriage. These ideas of negotiation, written agreements, and diplomatic rituals would echo in later empires across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Even after their empire collapsed, the Hittites were remembered by their neighbors. In biblical texts, for instance, the Hittites are mentioned, though sometimes this referred to smaller groups descended from the great empire scattered across the Levant and Anatolia. The memory of a once powerful people lingered in stories, even if blurred by time. Later kingdoms and cultures, such as the Assyrians, the Persians, and eventually the Greeks, inherited aspects of Hittite traditions. The massive gateways, the lion sculptures, the love of ritual, and the blending of gods from many lands, all these became part of a broader cultural current. The Hittites may have disappeared from maps, but their presence flowed beneath the surface of history. For centuries, the Hittites were forgotten by the world. Ancient writers seldom spoke of them, and their cities were lost beneath the soil. It was not until the 19th century that explorers and archaeologists began to uncover their traces. Travelers in Anatolia stumbled upon massive stone ruins and strange hieroglyphs carved into cliffs. At first, these signs were mysterious, belonging to no known people. Then, in the early 20th century, excavations at Hattusa revealed thousands of clay tablets. As scholars worked to decode them, the Hittites emerged from the silence of the past. A forgotten empire was remembered once more. Imagine the wonder of those first moments, realizing that the ruins scattered across Anatolia were not isolated sites, but part of a vast kingdom that had once stood beside Egypt and Babylon as an equal. Today, the Hittites are studied not only for their political history, but also for what they teach us about resilience, adaptation, and connection. Their empire rose in a landscape of challenges, rugged mountains, shifting alliances, and rival powers. They endured for centuries by learning to absorb influences from many cultures: Mesopotamian writing, Hurrian religious traditions, Egyptian diplomacy, while shaping them into something uniquely their own. For modern listeners, this is part of their quiet wisdom, the recognition that strength is not always about conquest. Often, it lies in the ability to learn, to blend, and to create harmony from diversity. As you listen, perhaps with your eyes gently closing, consider how the Hittite story is not finished. Archaeologists continue to uncover new sites. Each discovery adds more detail to the picture. A new temple, a new archive of tablets, or a carving hidden in stone. There is still much we do not know about them: their music, their daily laughter, the intimate rhythms of their homes. Each find brings us closer to understanding the people behind the empire. And so, the Hittite story is also a reminder of the future. Civilizations rise and fall, but memory can be revived. What is forgotten can be found again. Their legacy shows us that even after silence, voices may return. The Hittites began as small communities in the Anatolian highlands. They grew into an empire that stretched across thousands of miles, negotiating with Egypt, clashing with Babylon, and influencing countless neighbors. They faced crises, endured change, and eventually they faded. Yet their laws, their treaties, their languages, and their symbols lived on. Now, as you rest and reflect, imagine those stone lions standing guard at the gates of Hattusa. They have watched the centuries past, the rise and fall of empires, the quiet return of the forest, the footsteps of curious explorers. Through it all, they remain calm and unhurried, like guardians of memory. The Hittites remind us that history is never truly gone. It sleeps, waiting for us to listen. And in listening, we awaken not only their story, but also a deeper sense of connection to the long river of human experience. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the gentle rhythm of their story stay with you. The Hittites lived, learned, and left behind echoes that still whisper in the world around us. Their empire may have ended, but their legacy flows quietly, carrying lessons across the ages. And so, we reach the quiet end of our journey. The Hittites, once rulers of great cities and keepers of powerful treaties, now rest within the calm of history. Their voices have grown faint, but their legacy remains etched into stone, preserved in language, and remembered by those who walk among their ruins. As you reflect on their story, notice the contrast between then and now. Where once there was the uncertainty of empires, tonight you are safe, surrounded by the gentle quiet of the present moment. The worries of long ago belong to the past. All that remains for you is peace. Allow the images of ancient gates, soft winds, and distant hills to fade slowly from your mind. Let them become like dreams dissolving into the night, leaving only a sense of calm. Breathe deeply, rest easily, and let sleep come to you as softly as the echo of history itself. Good night.